Hello, good evening. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. Okay. Um, Welcome everyone to the 10th Annual Sculpture X Symposium and our first ever virtual symposium. It's so nice to see you all. I have to say, going virtual has its benefits because I can tell where you're all from. I see we have attendees from Texas, Colorado, Florida, California, not to mention all of our regional states, and as far away as Germany. We also have visitors from these universities: University of Tampa, Cooper Union, Mercyhurst, Kent State, Cleveland Institute of Art, Bowling Green State University, Edinburgh University, Indiana, Penn State, Pittsburgh, Chatham, Slippery Rock, Columbus College of Art and Design, Seton Hill, Ohio State, Mount Holyoke, and Columbia University. Thank you for joining us. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the 2020 Sculpture X Art and Agency Symposium co-hosts and sponsors. They are Allegheny College, Chatham University, Edinburgh University, Seton Hill University, Slippery Rock University, University of Pittsburgh, the Sculpture Center, and Civitas. Thank you to these institutions for your invested efforts in bringing everyone here together tonight. I would like to start by quoting one of my favorite children's books characters, Winnie the Pooh, who said, "You can't stay in your corner of the forest waiting for others to come to you. You have to go to them sometimes." As individuals, artists, and educators, we often take comfort in the shade of our community. However, as is often the case, we start talking to ourselves too much, and we realize we need to see what is happening in the rest of the forest. What are other artists doing? How are other artists coping? How are other artists surviving? How do we define our art? How do we define our success? Who speaks like me? Who doesn't speak like me? Who wants to speak with me? Thus began Sculpture X. Sculpture X was founded in 2010 and initiated by the Arts Collaborative in Erie, Pennsylvania, Civitas. The four founding institutions of Sculpture X are Edinburgh University, the Erie Art Museum, the Cleveland Institute of Art, and the Sculpture Center in Cleveland. The intent was to reach out into the expansive forest and cultivate connections among other artists, educators, curators, historians, administrators, and art enthusiasts. Sculpture X demonstrated its necessity and quickly grew as a teaching and networking platform to catalyze collaborations among educational and art institutions in the geographies of Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Western New York, West Virginia, Kentucky, Michigan, Indiana, and Ontario, Canada. The Sculpture Center in Cleveland now serves as the nexus for the ever-evolving Sculpture X. I, Grace Chin, came to my position as Executive Director of the Sculpture Center 1 year ago, and in conversation with Lisa Austin of Edinburgh University, Charles Tucker of Bowling Green State University, and the board president of the Sculpture Center, Marco Ciccarelli, I quickly realized the important role the Sculpture Center needed to serve in the mix of Sculpture X. Although the Sculpture Center is not a teaching institution per se, I like to think of the Sculpture Center as part of the ecosystem in the life of an artist and sculptor in particular. Where do all of the students and educators seek an active platform for regional art exhibitions and programs outside of their own institutions? Where does the Sculpture Center meet other artists and educators who are leaders in their own universities and region? I like to think of the Sculpture Center as a channel through which we can encourage individuals to participate in Sculpture X, where we can help cultivate connections between participants, offer a platform for artists involved with Sculpture X to exhibit their work, and serve as a place for artists mentoring others. The Sculpture Center is aptly suited to fill this role. The Sculpture Center was founded 31 years ago by David E. Davis, a prominent Cleveland sculptor with the intent to help artists in the early part of their career. The Sculpture Center's mission is to build a nurturing environment for the career advancement of emerging sculptors in which creativity and ideas can flourish. Since our founding, the Sculpture Center has supported the work of early career sculptors in Ohio and its contiguous states and Ontario, Canada, through its Revealed program, formerly known as Window to Sculpture, or W2S. This Keystone program is an open call to artists in the first 10 years of their career, working in three-dimensional forms, mixed media, installation, expanded media, relational aesthetics, and performance. Revealed has advanced the careers of sculptors by leveraging gallery representation, direct grant funding, university positions, tenure, and most importantly, the creation of work without commercial constraints. This vital exploration of contemporary art practices enriches opportunities not available otherwise to early career artists and improves the region's cultural, historic, and aesthetic landscape. Students, graduates, self-trained artists in the first 10 years of your career, take note. The Sculpture Center's open call for Revealed runs October through December. We will be placing the information on our website, sculpturecenter.org. Earlier, I mentioned the word mentors. A founding pillar of the Sculpture Center is the artist-mentor relationship. This was very much an important goal of David E. Davis when he started the Sculpture Center. As part of Sculpture X, we can assist with mentoring, as you may note in the one-on-one mentoring sessions that will be offered this week. The Revealed early career artists who exhibit at the Sculpture Center also serve as mentors with individuals at partnering institutions like the Cleveland Institute of Art and the Cleveland Public Library. I mentioned a little while ago, we eventually tire of talking to ourselves. At the Sculpture Center, we challenge sculpture to be in dialogue with a host of variables, including ourselves, our environment, our communities, our histories, our regional peers, our national peers, and artists working at all levels of their career. With every exhibition, we ask, how do we contextualize the work of an exhibiting artist? Even more so today, our dialogue is inspired by the many current events in our world. The art we make is an important contributor to this dialogue. This year, the Sculpture Center is launching a new program called Crossroads. Crossroads will be Cleveland's first citywide public art exhibition in augmented reality. We are collaborating with nationally renowned LA-based multidisciplinary artist Nancy Baker Cahill and Cleveland area artists to create and place 12 powerful works of art in augmented reality coupled with sites of political, cultural, and historical significance. We hope this exhibition will create conversations by examining the forgotten, buried, or overwritten histories of our past. We hope it will connect community and public voices through dialogue-driven artworks in underserved neighborhoods. We hope it will contribute to the national conversation on inclusivity and the social issues affecting our lives and communities. And finally, we hope it will cultivate a strong, diverse community of under-recognized Cleveland area artists of color. Similarly, this year's Sculpture X Symposium, Art and Agency, addresses ways that contemporary artists are creating new narratives that connect and interact broadly, often bypassing disciplinary and even national boundaries in their attempts to reshape the world. At tonight's opening at 5:30, Paula Burley, Assistant Professor of Art History at Allegheny College and Director of the Allegheny Art Galleries, introduces writer Aruna D'Souza, writer, historian, cultural producer, and curator Kilolo Luckett, and political scientist Rhonda Matthews. This extraordinary quartet of individuals will examine how the art world, no less than the country at large, has persistently struggled with the politics of race and the ways this struggle has influenced how museums, curators, and artists wrestle with notions of free speech. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., Assistant Professor of Visual Arts James Laux of Chatham University and writer, filmmaker, and architect Madeline Schwartzman will examine how contemporary artists use science and technology to consider how we see and sense the world around us. Even more so today, our dialogue is inspired by the many current events in our world. The COVID pandemic is affecting the way we work, talk, teach, and express ourselves. This is why tonight we are convening here together through each of our own screens. On Thursday at 12 p.m., I will talk with Kyle Dankowitz of Sculpture Center New York and artists Kenneth Tam and Basira Khan about how artists and educators are grappling with challenges posed by the pandemic in their teaching and art making. On Friday at 12, Delaney Jenkins, chair of the Department of Studio Arts at the University of Pittsburgh, will speak with artists Sharon Massey and Sean Derry and their students. Massey and Derry collaborate on social practice projects that engage community members in a range of art-making processes. As a collaborative, they work on a larger scale to develop projects targeted at expressing underrepresented voices. As part of the ecosystem that I was referring to earlier, on Friday at 3 p.m., artist Angie Sikora will present 7 early career artists who have previously attended Sculpture X and 1 alumni artist of the Sculpture Center's Revealed program. These artists are Sage Baxter, Abigail Olive Benkovich, Kimberly Blois, Riley Brown, Melanie Lancetel, Ella Medicus, David Ross, and Caitlin Sweetland. On Friday at 5:30 p.m., Tom Cuomo, professor of art and art history at Slippery Rock University, will have a conversation with J. Morgan Pruitt of Mildred's Lane, a 94-plus acre residency in Pennsylvania where individuals are asked to collectively create new modes of being in the world. On the last day of the symposium, Saturday at 10 a.m., we invite you to bring your ideas and join Patty Beachley, chair of the Art and Design Department and associate professor of art at Seton Hill University, and artist Angie Sikora in planning next year's Sculpture X, which will be held in Pittsburgh. On Saturday at 2, Charlotte Wellman, associate professor of art history at Edinburgh University, will have a conversation with Edinburgh alumna Sohaila Azadi about the intersection of gender, aging, and the visual arts. At 4 p.m. on Saturday, Delaney Jenkins, chair of the Department of Studio Arts at the University of Pittsburgh, will meet with writer, historian, cultural producer, and curator Kilolo Luckett, and Ivorian American artist Marvin Ture to discuss themes of race and mental health in contemporary art. Finally, on Saturday at 5:30, we close with Patty Beachley, who is one of the organizers of Sculpture X 2021, and she will give us a taste of what to expect for next year's symposium. So I want to get back to where I started, Winnie the Pooh, who said, "You can't stay in your corner of the forest waiting for others to come to you. You have to go to them sometimes." I believe it is only when we put ourselves outside and make ourselves vulnerable, then that is when the meaningful conversation can begin. Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Lisa Austin.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sculpture X, all virtual. I'm going to share my screen and just show you a few slides. Grace, are you able to see my slide?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. So as you know, it's all virtual, as I mentioned, and I was going to give you a little bit of the history. My name is Lisa Austin, and I'm actually speaking to you from the Bruce Gallery office here on the campus of Edinburgh University. And Edinburgh University played a big role in Sculpture X's formation. I was hired to teach here in Western Pennsylvania almost 20 years ago. I moved to Erie, and I worked with my colleagues here at the university always to try to bring in art stars from New York, et cetera. But we realized that our funding was really kind of limited in being able to do that. Edinburgh is a very rural location. It takes about a day to get here. So we didn't have the money to bring in all the people that we'd hoped to. So we realized and started to think about, well, we're living close to Cleveland, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh. They're about 2 hours away. And so I started reaching out to people, administrators, artists, teachers in these different locations. And that's how we actually started Sculpture X. The first person that was really engaged in this was Grace's predecessor at the Sculpture Center, and that's Ann Albano. And she was very enthused about trying to create what we're calling a network, a platform to allow free exchange of faculty. I would, for instance, go to Kent State and return somebody from Kent State would come to visit my students. And also we were trying to get exhibitions going. And one of the people that Ann introduced us to was Lane Cooper, who teaches at Cleveland Institute of Art. She is still there and was one of the founding members of this organization. Dietrich Wegner, who is now the assistant chair here at Edinburgh, actually did the first networking Sculpture X website. Saul Ostro, who at the time was teaching at the Cleveland Institute of Art, came up with the idea for the symposium. He said, if you're going to all this trouble, let's put together an actual meeting where people can get together. So this is really his idea. Charles Tucker was also teaching at the Cleveland Institute of Art at the time, and he was one of the founding members. And then John Venko played an instrumental role. John was the director of the Erie Art Museum at the time, and he and Ann worked together to jointly present the first Sculpture X exhibition. And I have a slide of it here. They invited curator David Carrier, who actually reviewed artwork by faculty living in Pittsburgh, not Pittsburgh, but Pennsylvania and also in Ohio, and curated a show. And the same set of 6 artists were showing simultaneously in both Cleveland and in Erie. So this was the first opportunity for that. Now, the thing that has turned out to be the strongest component of Sculpture X is actually these symposiums. We held them for 3 years in Cleveland. Then they moved on to Columbus. They went to Detroit for a year. They were briefly in Pittsburgh during the International Sculpture Conference, back to Detroit, and then they were at Bowling Green and in Toledo. And these are just a few snapshots that I was able to find, just giving you the sort of the history, the 10-year history of the sort of organization. What's important to notice is that they move around, and there is no really hierarchy. The local organization, the local groups, the local faculty, and the administrators come together and decide on programming, workshops, gathering funding, et cetera. So it's a grassroots organization that now really has a strong institutional home at the Sculpture Center, which is handling the fiscal end of all that we do. This year, we have this great team put together here that you're going to be meeting over the next few days. And we've all been working very hard to put this together, and we're excited to have you all tonight. So I'm going to turn this over to Paula Burley, who is actually she's organized the first official event for Sculpture X. So Paula, I'm gonna hope that you are able to, I'm gonna stop screen sharing so that you can take over.
Okay, thanks so much, Lisa. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Thanks to both Lisa and Grace for inviting me to convene this first panel. I'm really delighted to be here and honored to be among this really exciting group of scholars. So I wanted to, well, a couple of things. First, I've been asked to remind everyone that we are recording everything this evening. So just participants and visitors do keep that in mind. Next, I wanted to just mention the Q&A function. So those of you who are in the audience, please do feel free to use the Q&A to submit questions. And throughout our chat, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A, and I'll just try and find times to read your questions to the panelists so that they can address them, as that makes sense in the course of the conversation. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce the panelists today. So let me just find my bios. So first I'll begin with, we're just going alphabetically, with Aruna D'Souza. Aruna writes about modern and contemporary art, intersectional feminisms, and other forms of politics, and how museums shape our views of each other and the world. Her most recent book, White Walling, Art, Race, and Protest in 3 Acts, published by Badlands Unlimited, was named one of the best art books of 2018 by the New York Times, and I just read it this summer and thought it was fascinating. Kilolo Luckett is an art historian, curator, and writer based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. With over 20 years of experience in arts administration and cultural production, she is committed to elevating the voices of underrepresented visual artists, specifically women and artists of color. She is consulting curator of visual arts at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center and serves as an art commissioner for the City of Pittsburgh's Art Commission. She is founder and executive director of the forthcoming space Alma Lewis, or Alma/Lewis, I'm not sure how one says it, named after the abstract artists Alma Thomas and Norman Lewis, an experimental contemporary art platform for critical thinking, dialogue, and creative expression dedicated to Black culture. She is currently writing an authorized biography of Naomi Sims, one of the first Black supermodels. Next, we have Rhonda Matthews. She's an associate professor of political science and women's studies in the Department of Political Science and Criminal Justice at Edinburgh University. Matthews is dedicated to the advocacy and empowerment of women and children as a result of her previous work as a sexual assault survivor counselor. Using tenets of intersectional analysis, her primary areas of academic interest include gender and women's studies, sociological theory, popular culture, and stratification. She is a longtime fan of science fiction, superheroes, and comic books, and she is married to a badass man who together are rearing one badass daughter. Mm-hmm. And finally, Leslie Sotomayor is an artist, curator, and educator in art education at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. Sotomayor focuses on Gloria Anzaldua's theory of conocimiento and autohistoriateria, I'm so sorry about my pronunciation, a feminist writing practice of theorizing one's experiences as transformative acts to guide her curatorial studio practice and teaching methodology in curating environments for empowerment. So as you can see, very smart and high power group. I'm very excited to talk to all of you. When thinking about what we were going to discuss today, I think that we all wanted to think about some of the charged and complex conversations that are happening around sculpture in the public sphere right now. And specifically, this summer we saw the reigniting of a very polarizing debate around the sometimes clandestine or forcible removal of public statuary. This, conversation is not new. Specifically, it was really predicated on the removal of Confederate monuments a couple of years back, but with the rise of BLM, Black Lives Matter protests, specifically incited by the murder of George Floyd, we're seeing whole new kind of facets to this conversation emerging. And this seemed like an urgent moment to kind of reassess the power, the symbolic power that sculpture wields in the public sphere, and to kind of think about that conversation and how it's evolving. The panelists have put together some images, or they might just make opening remarks without images. We thought it would be nice to start with at least a few images to give everyone a sense of the kind of visual, some of the visual terms of this conversation if you're maybe not super familiar with the conversation. I'm just going to start myself with a couple of images and then pass it along, and that's the most talking that I will be doing all evening. But let me just go into screen share mode we'll see. This screen is a little unfamiliar. I think the webinar format is kind of throwing me for a loop.
If you slide your cursor down to the bottom, it says share screen usually.
Yeah, I did that. It's, So I think because it's in webinar, it's not sort of, let me try it one more time. Oh, okay, now it's working. All right, it did something very strange for a moment. Can you see the first slide of this that says Sculpture X?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. Okay, so it is showing the PowerPoint. Great. All right, so I just have 3 images that focus on a recent incident that occurred this summer that for me kind of where a lot of these different questions started to coalesce and catalyzed my thinking around it and my desire to talk to the panelists about it tonight. So specifically, this photograph is from June 7th in Bristol in England, when protesters who were specifically protesting the murder of George Floyd came together to topple a public statue of Edward Colston. Edward Colston was alive in the late 17th century. He was a local merchant and philanthropist, but the money for his philanthropy was largely funded by his involvement with the transatlantic slave trade. And so this was a monument that had really come under public scrutiny since the 1990s. The protesters came together and using ropes, they toppled it, they defaced it, and then you see them here summarily tossing it into the Bristol Harbor, where I believe it may remain. So they took down the bronze statuary, and then, and I know this is a bit of a grainy photograph, I apologize, it's taken from an Instagram post. And so on that same day, on June 7th, one of the protesters, Jen Reed, was kind of motivated by the spirit of the event to climb atop that newly empty plinth. And she raised her fist in the Black Power salute. And then a photograph of her doing so circulated on Instagram. This captured the attention of the London-based sculptor Mark Quinn, who reached out to Jen Reed and asked if she might sit for a sculpture and become a model for a sculpture that he would make to replace the Edward Colston sculpture and to place without the permission of Bristol on that empty plinth. And so he did. So this was installed by Mark Quinn and his team on July 15th without the permission of the Bristol City Council. It was removed 24 hours later on July 16th. And so he made a resin sculpture. He talked about wanting to use bronze, but he didn't want to add several months onto the production. So maybe thinking about the kind of material facts of this is somewhat interesting. He called it a surge of power, and it's a sculpture memorializing Jen Reed's powerful gesture on top of that space where the toppled statue no longer existed. Again, this was removed, and something that struck me as really interesting was the mayor of Bristol commented specifically, the sculpture that has been installed today, so when this was installed, was the work and decision of a London-based artist. It was not requested and permission was not given for it to be installed. And I think it's really striking that the mayor names him not by name, but as by place. And so there's this tension that's coming to the fore with the kind of urban imposition of will on the more peripheral town. And so I think it highlights some of the interesting power dynamics at play here. The mayor of Bristol was not the only one to criticize Mark Quinn's sculpture. A number of other artists came out, and there were articles in Art News and the Art newspaper saying that this was not the right move, that what Mark Quinn should have done was perhaps funded a Black artist to make a similar sculpture, and that to impose his own kind of artistic vision, however, good his intentions may have been, was not really the gesture that was needed in this moment where people are calling for a reassessment of power dynamics in the public sphere and for equity, because Mark Quinn is a white British artist and a man. So there's just a number of issues there. And I think that this points to a series of questions that I just want to sort of get out there. And then I will pass the baton. Some questions that I'm hoping we can all think about tonight, among others. And some of these are my questions, and some of these came up over email and were generated by the panel. So this is a sort of collective questioning. So in general, I think considering sculpture's symbolic power and what kind of power the monument or the statue wields in the public sphere. Wondering if the kind of traditional figurative sculpture valorizing the accomplishment of the individual is becoming an irrelevant genre. Are we witnessing the end of the kind of individual figurative sculpture? What kinds of art historical contexts inform these contemporary conversations around monuments? What is the potential role of public sculpture in our current polarized political landscape? What role does this play? To that end, what are we avoiding, perhaps, when we focus on monuments? How do the monuments become proxies in these conversations for other issues? How do they maybe those supplant those other issues? And lastly, what ideas do we want to preserve for public memory? Oh, and that's not last. I wrote down one more thing. Sorry, just a moment ago. The last question, lastly, was I was just thinking about, what role does the artist play in all of this? Because I think historically, when we talk about these kind of public statuary, valorizing the accomplishments of the individual, we often talk about the subject. It's one of the few art forms where the subject takes precedent over the creator. So, I mean, the creator of the Edward Colston statue was John Cassidy, but no one cares. They care about Edward Colston. But here, in the removal of the Jen Reed sculpture and the discussion around the kind of political power at play, Mark Quinn really became a major subject of this conversation, his role, his identity, his gesture. So what role is the artist playing in this conversation, and how is that changing? So those are a few questions that I wanted to just throw out, again, generated by myself and the panel. So now let me move on. I have included here, and I'm trying to remember, Aruna, are these your images, right?
They are mine. If you don't mind going to the other ones.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll start there and then move on to the one that you just had up on the screen.
Yeah, just let me know when you want me to switch around.
Sure, great. So first of all, thank you all for including me in the conversation today. In a way, it couldn't have come at a better time for me, because I have just finished, and when I say just finished, I mean like 2 days ago finished an essay for the Socrates Sculpture Park on monuments, and thinking about questions of monuments and politics and power, and what we are fighting about when we're fighting over monuments. My thinking sort of started with this really classic essay, I mean, a classic to a fault. Everyone cites it when they talk about monuments, by the German novelist Robert Musil, who wrote The Man Without Qualities. But he wrote in 1927 this essay on monuments, where he said, there is nothing so invisible as a monument, right? That he was interested in the way in which, or he was complaining about, really, the way in which monuments become such a familiar part of the walls of our consciousness that they become invisible to us, that they are so aesthetically uninteresting that they become something we'd rather ignore. And he actually talks about the ways in which all of these sort of qualities aren't just banal, but they're actually repellent, that monuments ultimately in some psychological way repel us, and that they invite their own vandalism, right? And I started thinking about the ways in which monuments, we often think of them as sort of markers of a stable history, markers of a historical moment, moments in which people decided that this was what needed to be commemorated. But, for many of our historical monuments, the monument is put up as an act of aggression or an act of declaration. They're put up in order to declare victory, even if the battle has not been fully won, the ideological battle has not been fully won. And so they're trying to say, they're trying to argue for a side, and that it's only when monuments are vandalized or turned around on themselves, in the way that this monument to Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, was both tagged with graffiti, but also the subject of this projection of George Floyd's face and the Black Lives Matter slogans that was enacted by two figures, Alex Creaky and Dustin Klein, who were part of the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests in Richmond. I'm interested in the way in which that's the moment at which the true content, the moment of its defacement, is when the true content of the statue, the effigy, the monument, becomes revealed, right? Until that point, it's meaningless. When it's meaningful is the point where people fight back against it in a certain sense. And so for me, these monuments and these arguments over monuments are really important because they're moments in which we're finally able to have the conversations that we aren't having sufficiently or aren't having completely in other means of public discourse. For this Richmond statue, I don't actually believe that people were protesting the statue just because Robert E. Lee was a person that they don't feel is worth celebrating, or in fact, that they feel should not be celebrated. That's part of it. But part of the reason that this monument means something now to the protesters and needs to be protested is that there's a recognition that we are still living in a country that is built on the values of Robert E. Lee, that is built on the values that were supposed to have been left behind at the end of the Civil War, right? So that's why the Robert E. Lee Monument means something now. It's because it's not a marker of the past. It's a marker of the very real racial inequity, the very real anti-Blackness, the very real violence that that continues to happen, that is rooted in America's past, but that endures, right? And so that is why these monuments are being defaced. It's a way of attacking a state that is trying to kill them, the protesters, and for those of us who aren't Black, who aren't descendants of slavery, that it's a sign of the ways in which that the state, this country that we live in, still upholds those values. So I began thinking about this, and I began thinking about the ways in which the most interesting contemporary practices to me don't have anything to do with building new monuments to individual figures. They don't have anything to do with building new monuments to sort of raising up those historical figures that have been forgotten, but really they have to do with the ways in which certain artists are flipping the meaning of monuments, or building upon and reversing, undermining the terms of the monuments. The Situationists use the term détournement. So I think of these as sculptural détournement. So one of those artists is the artist Krzysztof Wodiczko, who has been doing projections before projections were cool. He's been doing projections onto public monuments for a long time, but in this case, in this project that he did in Madison Square Park in last year, in this case, he is projecting onto another Civil War figure, in this case, an admiral fighting for the North. And he projects the images of various refugees from around the world who are talking about their trauma of living, of being forced from their homes and making their way to the US. And in part, this is a way for Wodiczko to enact a kind of what he thinks of, I think, as a collective healing, what I would call a form of restorative justice through art. Because the Civil War, not many of us know this, I think, but the Civil War triggered one of the most significant refugee crises of the modern era, comparable in proportion to some of the crises that we're seeing now. And so here is a statue which hides that part of this history of the Civil War, and that is now allowed to come to the surface. The enactor of violence, this admiral, is now having to ventriloquize the pain of the victims of current refugee crises, and we as the viewers have to sort of take part, witness, come to terms with that. And now, if you don't mind switching to the other slide. And the other monument that I'm really interested in is this piece by the artist Lauren Wood, called American Monument, and that is extremely unmonumental in its look. First of all, because it's shown in a gallery. It's not a figure. It doesn't have a fixed, stable form. It travels around the country, but it is interesting to me because it is a monument that's trying to convey not simply individuals, but systems. It is a monument to a set of encounters between the state and between state power, and between the state and state power, and Black people who have been murdered over the past several years by the police. And each of the records on the turntables that you see there is a set of sounds that are related to each of those individual murders of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, et cetera, et cetera. And so the viewer is invited to lower the needle onto the album, onto the record, and hear these accumulations of sounds that have been gathered through a very diligent use of the Freedom of Information Act, that, so that she was able to get, dash cam videos, witness recordings, things like that to put together to create these portraits. And they're portraits, as I said, not of an individual, even though they're marked to each individual, they consecrate each individual, but they are really portraits of the system of power that structured the encounter between the police and these individuals, and ask us to think of history in terms of these relationships of power, in terms of structural racism, as opposed to in terms of individual heroism or individual victimization. So those are the images that I had for you. Sorry if I went on too long, but I'm sort of right in the middle of thinking about this. So thank you.
Okay. Leslie, were these your images,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. Okay. So thank you for having me. So when I was thinking about and discussing with the other panelists about some ideas around this monuments and sculptures, one of the things that came to mind was revisiting Judy Baca's 1996 essay entitled "Whose Monument Where? Public Art in a Many-Cultural Society." And in revisiting her essay from 1996, it could have been written now, right? Because so many of the things that she was talking about and so many of the questions that she brings up is so relevant to the conversations that we're engaging today. And just to give a little bit of a background, 2 decades later in 2020, or over two decades later, this questioning is more relevant than ever when Judy Baca considers the question of what shall we choose to memorialize in our time, right? Which is one of the questions that as a panel, we are grappling with, and we're grappling with as a nation with these various social issues that have come about. And so looking at mural and artwork on murals and what is depicted, not quite sculpture in the traditional sense, but what cultural memory are we holding on to, and what representations are we holding on to in our communities, in our everyday lives, and how does that shed light on the disparities of our histories, right? So the continued murders of Black and brown bodies in our country is yet another symptom of the deeply racist white supremacist society and government system that at its inception is a site for memorializing through the service of dominance that Baca critiques in her essay. And I revisit her essay as a place for critical reflection for what is happening not only in our country today with sculptural movements, and for integrating my own practice as an artist into the public space, but also when we look at this image of the great, what came known to be the Great Wall, which is the history of California that she began to create as a collaboration with other artists and youth in the California area in the late 1970s, and grew with each segment of the mural piece as an addition of another decade and the historical contextualizing of this other decade. For me, it was really interesting to revisit this piece and the thinking about why do we do what we do as artists? How do we engage with the community? What conversations come about with the community? Do conversations come about with the community? Which I think is one of the threads that we're pulling at in this panel discussion, right? Who's being consulted in these decision-making opportunities for creating sculptures and engaging with these pieces? And some of the questions that I feel are still relevant, that we're still grappling with as artists and as community and as a nation, is, does the public art sites engage, listen, and respond to the community that it aims to serve? Does public art serve as merely a proxy, ignoring the needs of the community it inhabits, even if only temporarily? Can art facilitate creative ways for engagement and navigating difficult issues, emotions, and well-being? And it also narrates stories, but whose stories? Right? Who has the power to create these stories? And with the Great Wall, I feel it's a wonderful, it's a great example of what collaboration and contextualized history via the arts can look like, with an intergenerational approach of working as a community, doing research and designing ideas and curating ideas that are relevant to the people that are working within these projects. I'll say one more thing before we move on, but in revisiting Baca's inquiries from her essay in 1996, I want to just repeat some of the questions that she brought forth that I feel we're still at the foreplay now. What then is the role of socially responsible public art? As the wealthy and poor are increasingly polarized in our society, can public art avoid coming down on the side of wealth and dominance in that confrontation? How can we as artists avoid becoming accomplices to colonization? If we choose not to look at triumphs over nations and neighborhoods as victories and advancements, what monuments could we build? How can we create a public memory for a many-cultured society? And whose stories shall we tell in that process? And I think that as we're moving forward, and as Paula even opened up with sharing, how are we witnessing a deconstruction of this type of memorializing that we have been conditioned and followed in this vein of traditional thinking in what we situate in our different communities throughout the US. how can we reimagine these spaces? How can we build and forge communities and collaborative efforts with where these sculptures and art pieces are being housed and are being consumed on an everyday level? And how do we disassociate that or make intentional and conscious efforts so that our colonial embedded past and present is beginning to be dismantled in some way? So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about in my own studio practice and as an educator. And you know, with this panel conversation has kind of brought up some of these questions for me to interrogate with my own practice. But as I collaborate with other artists and artists of colors in my community, what does this mean to us? How do we actually put forth meaningful collaborative community efforts that are not just a tokenizing or a recursive systemic pattern that continues to form and take place and is part of this systemic oppression?
Just one moment while I switch over to Google Slides to pull up Kilolo's images, which are right here. Oh, no, not share. Present. Okay, Kilolo, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Thank you, Paula. And good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with this esteemed panel of experts here. And thank you, SculptureX, for inviting me to participate in this. So my name is Kilolo Luckett, and I'm based in Pittsburgh. I've lived here half my life. And one of this first slide that you have here that everybody's seeing is one of my first jobs right out of college. I worked for a nonprofit, a gallery downtown Pittsburgh called Wood Street Galleries, and I was the curatorial assistant. And so we oversaw several different sites downtown Pittsburgh that were temporary and also kind of like public, permanent public installations. And this one is a temporary site. And I got to work on the planning and execution of this sculpture called Palazzo Nudo by Alexander Brodsky, who is a Russian architect. He's known as being a paper architect. And so the three kind of sculptural installations that I'm putting forth today are ones that I'm very familiar with, that and I know all of the artists and the processes that kind of went into this. And also that you'll see that all of these works are, for the most part, non-representational. And I did that intentionally to see how we can exercise our minds to not think so literal, because I think as a society, we are very much conditioned to think a certain way. When you see an actual figure, it's supposed to evoke a certain type of mood, or evoke power or authority or a certain history, or obscure a certain history or histories. And so with Alexander Brodsky, which I thought was just so beautiful, and this was in 1999, and it's no longer there, what he did was, we had all of these like 19th and 20th century fragments of ornate pieces from buildings that were demolished. And so he took all of this scaffolding, and it was almost like this bird cage that was housing, it was almost like this reliquary in a way, of all these kind of treasures of different pieces of history. And I just thought that was so poetic and powerful. And although it wasn't anything actually like figurative, people really gravitated to this. They thought it was very wild and but very imaginative and something that really provoked conversation. And so, you know, from people thinking it was like a pile of concrete pieces to a whole bunch of other things. But the thing is, it sparked conversations and people wanting to know more about, like, oh, what is this building piece? And so why did this artist choose these things? These elements to compose this piece that is essentially this skeleton of a building in a way. And so I thought that this was such a profound way to execute a public piece that really spoke to so many different people, so many different walks of life. And so, Paula, if you could go to the next slide. Do you mind going to the other one? Yes, that's one, okay. Yeah, the other one, this one, yes, thank you. So this piece also was in downtown Pittsburgh. This is right outside of the August Wilson African American Cultural Center. And this is a work on your far left called Two Steps from the Blues by Martha Jackson Jarvis, who is an artist based in Washington, DC. And she does a lot of large scale public work from, you know, all over the world, from Italy to, you just name it. I mean, she's done a lot of great work. And this piece called Two Steps from the Blues, when I did a studio visit a couple of years ago for a show that I did at the August Wilson Center, it was the middle image that you see. She had these kind of, it's a steel, concrete, cast concrete, and this black matte paint assembled, and with these black and white stripes with these red accents. And it was dismantled. And so I just thought it was really interesting, this kind of pyramid shape. And I asked her, you know, Martha, tell me more about this piece, because for some reason for me, it's really pulling me, it's calling me for it to come to Pittsburgh. And so she started telling me about how, you know, she does reclaimed, she finds things out in the, in nature. She does a lot of recycling and upcycling. And so she was like, yeah, this is reclaimed steel. And this is a cast concrete, this pyramid. And I just thought, in listening to her talk about this work, I was just like, I really want this to be installed outside of the August Wilson Center, but also because of, I see it as this kind of history of this very working class industrial history of Pittsburgh, and also even beyond, you know, predating kind of like the industrial kind of revolution. Because of the rivers, because we have 3 rivers in Pittsburgh, but there's also this 4th river that kind of runs underneath Pittsburgh. And so with this piece, I thought, okay, there's it being installed outside and its relationship to these other buildings. We have a building called the Gulf Tower, and there is this weather bell that's almost like this pyramid shape. And it lights up. So depending on if it's raining or if it's gonna snow, it lights up different colors to let you know what the temperature, not the temperature, but what the weather's going to be. And so that she has on this tip these different colors. You can't really see, but there's these very subtle colors that she has that kind of animates the tip of this pyramid. And then also, the ties to these kind of almost look like these piano keys that are articulating the steel that are going in different directions. And if you think about the history of, you know, music and jazz and blues in Pittsburgh, from the Hill District, from so many different people that come through here. And so once again, you know, I was challenging people, visitors, and people that are walking by to you know, look at this and see like what's going on. What are you thinking about? What makes you look at it, look away, think it's ugly, think it's beautiful? And it was really interesting to hear some of the comments from people. People never thought that they could really understand like an abstract or a conceptual piece. And so this piece is no longer here. It went back to Martha. But now, since it's gone, we hear a lot of people saying that they miss it being there. And so, once again, I just think about in this moment of how controversial a lot of figurative work is really, I would just say that it really is kind of creating a lot of tension with people and folks wanting to say that they want something torn down or they want to keep it because if they want to tear it down because of it is polarizing, it is oppressive, or if somebody wants to keep, say, a Confederate monument because it's about celebrating their heritage, and if you remove it, it's going to diminish my culture. And those are things that we've never, as a country, really ever come to terms with. It's usually you take something down and we never have any real conversations that are really meaningful. I find that I'm actually from the South. I was born in Mississippi, and it's a different type of sensibility. But living in the North and being in Pittsburgh, I do find it that we celebrate our own cultures and we kind of stay in our own neighborhoods, and there isn't much coming together culturally and really celebrating all of our differences. And so this piece really brought a lot of people together. It wasn't around one particular or single identity. And so Paula, if you could go to the last slide. I think it's the previous, yeah, the other, this one. Yes, the other one. Yes, this one, great. So this series of images, the first one on your left is, all of these works are by a sculptor by the name of Thaddeus Mosley, who lives and works in Pittsburgh. And currently he has an installation, a trio of bronze work that's on view at Rockefeller Center for Frieze Sculpture. And they're the three pieces to your left. And this is the first time that Thad has done work in bronze. Most of his work is in wood. He hand carves everything. He doesn't use any type of electric tools or anything like that. And so you'll see this is Thad in the middle. He's 94 and he's in his studio every day. And here he is with Martha Jackson Jarvis, actually, talking about his work. And so what the curator for Brett Littman did for Frieze Sculpture, he did this kind of cast of Thad's wood sculptures. And then the one on your right is a whole bunch of glass pieces, glass sculptures that Thad has done. And he basically, these are all found glass pieces that he then assembled. And once again, living in Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh's glass history, PPG, he basically took these pieces that he found around his home when he lived on the South Side. And so this is with Martha Jackson Jarvis on a second time that she was in Pittsburgh. And so once again, these are all very kind of abstract pieces that Thad does, but it really speaks about spirituality, the environment, nature, and it also talks about, you know, he does a lot of cultural references, whether it's African work, looking at different sculptors that he's really been inspired by, from whether it's Brancusi to Noguchi. And I do think that, once again, it has this more universality to it that I think that people really, really do gravitate towards. And so some of the questions that I've been thinking about is, whose story or stories are being told? Whose history is being told? How is power being exerted, and why? And these are things that people tend to not think about when you tend to see one sculpture of a person that you can identify with. And so I tend to really look at public art of, how do we see the familiar in non-representational or conceptual or impressionistic work? And so I want to really challenge people to really think beyond these representational way of how public art has been traditionally been made and been put out there. And so this is where I'm going to leave it right now, and then I would love to get into conversations with other people. So thank you.
Thanks, Kalilo. I am going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Rhonda, if Rhonda wants to make any opening remarks. Rhonda, I don't think you had images, but I think you were just maybe gonna, if you want to just talk a little about your thinking about this or respond to anything you've just heard, whatever you'd like to do.
Okay. No, I didn't have images, but I do just want to kind of give a brief introduction into the things that I'd like to talk about. I think that the goal of art, as it pertains to politics and social life, can do several things. I think it can that it can maintain and support cultural messaging, right? Whether people like it or not, generally, that's one of the things that art does. It presents to us current cultural messaging. It can also present an alternate view of socio-political actions and politics in general. The fact that we often have kind of wide-ranging discussions about art based on whether or not we think it's appropriate is part of what art does, right? It presents these alternate points of view. The other thing that it does is that it can do is present a way to bridge the gaps in knowledge that we have in our society, which then allows conversations and discussions about things that maybe we've never thought about before to occur, right? Sometimes art puts a glaring spotlights on those gaps in knowledge. But I am unusually focused on the kinds of quote unquote degenerate art that we don't necessarily see in museums. I focus a lot on popular culture. So when I think of art, I think of it as being accessible to most people. I think about the types of art that we want to discuss tonight, but I also think about popular culture as political content and statement. So the types of art and sculpture that I want to discuss tonight, especially, are the kinds of art that perform the same functions as, say, the Beyonce Ape Shit video. And that is to place art as a statement of politics in a form of media that reaches the widest possible audience for the purpose of disseminating a message to spur conversation and debate. So the ways in which we discuss monuments, which is what we're going to be talking about here tonight, seems to grow more contentious only when the monuments are actually removed or defaced. And that is because that's when the status quo is challenged. At that point, what we begin to see is the tension between ideal culture and real culture, right? Those, when a monument is moved, destroyed, or defaced, it's at that point that this chasm between ideal culture and real culture becomes exceedingly apparent. So ideal, when I say ideal culture, what I mean are, those lofty notions that are contained in the founding documents, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all of that kind of stuff. So those are our ideal notions in our culture. The real culture is what we actually do in our socio-political actions on a daily basis. So when those two factors of human life come into contact, it is only then that the concept of community memory comes into dispute. Because what the monuments represent usually is only one type of community memory, right? And there's a whole lot of other types of memory out here and a whole lot of other experiences that aren't being displayed in the monument. So what I want to do is discuss this tension between the ideal and real, because I think that if liberation is to be achieved, then those differences have to be identified, and they have to be properly addressed, and then they have to be rectified. The status quo requires propaganda. It requires propaganda to keep it in public memory. And what these monuments do is they act as propaganda, but they do something a little bit different than the propaganda that we might see on television or that we might see in print media, et cetera. What it does is it gives the propaganda physical presence in modern public life. So in the modern public sphere, we still see monuments to the Confederacy, right? So the Confederacy occurs, in our distant history. However, the presence of the monument keeps it alive and propagandizes it in current memory. So, my primary question, the thing that I want us to interrogate here tonight, is this chasm between ideal culture and real culture. Okay. So that's just kind of my introduction to things. So I guess now we can go ahead and start discussing, huh?
Well, Rhonda, I agree with everything you just said. Although I'm not sure that, I have to think through, because it's a different vocabulary than I'm used to, the distinction between ideal and real culture. But I do, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, okay, yeah, that's what freedom of speech is, right? Like everyone,
Right.
The freedom of speech is like this form of ideal culture, but in practice, it is, it's as easily a weapon as a tool, right? Like it's
Exactly.
as easily a form of suppression as it is a form of freedom, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, I love I love having those new words to put to it. So that's great.
The thing that made me think about this was that I actually, a few months ago, I had an experience with, well, it's been longer than a few months ago. I forget, I haven't been in the outside for about 8 months now, but I was at a tour given by the Hubbard House, which is in Ashtabula, Ohio. The Hubbard House is the last stop on, was the last stop on the Underground Railroad in Ohio. So like from the Hubbard House, you can literally see Lake Erie, right? So I was there because there was this tour of the places in Ashtabula that were important to the Underground Railroad. And afterwards, everybody came back to the Hubbard House, and we were sitting having dinner and or having lunch. And the woman who was sitting next to me, who I did not know, we were, you know, chit-chatting and having a good time until she brought up, and she brought it up, I didn't. She brought up how awful it was that what they were doing with these Confederate monuments.
Temperature drop.
It did not go well for her. but I thought one of the things I said to her was that do you recognize that having Confederate monuments in the modern era, at a time when I am actually free, is a message that was good too, right? And I don't think she had ever thought of that before. She still didn't agree with me, right? It's the history, right? But okay, but what about my history? And that's what makes me think about this tension and who gets to whose message gets to be presented in public art. So the Confederacy, you know, quote unquote past tense, gets to be represented, but my history does not. And so I don't even think she realized that she was saying it, but that's precisely what we were talking about.
Well, you know, it's so interesting because, you know, I've been on a take down all monuments. Like, I don't want monuments anymore. In the sense of monuments to the heroic individual or even the heroic victim, right? Like, I don't want either of those things. I don't want this idea of history centered around individuals. But then I listened to Leslie and Judith Baca, and I think, okay, maybe that's premature. And then I listened to Kilolo's great presentation on Mosley and Jackson, and I think, okay, you know, so maybe there are other ways of getting into it, as you know, other ways of conceiving it, so that monumentality can be understood as abstraction, right? Like, I mean, in a certain sense. So I don't know. I have to say that the conversation has really, like, you know, made me soften a little from my, because I always say to people, you know, if we kept up every monument, like, you know, people who are so worried about the destruction of monuments, right? If we kept up every monument that has been built over the course of human history, we would literally be drowning in monuments. Like, there wouldn't be enough space for people if all the monument, right? We destroy things all the time, right? Like, that's part of, you know, and you know, in some cases we cheer the destruction, right? Like, you know, and you know, and so I sort of, you know, so I don't have a huge, I'm less interested in the object itself than in the debates or in the power struggles that that object reveals. So, you know, so that's part of it for me. But then, you know, I think, you know, Leslie certainly, Judith Baca via Leslie makes a really important argument why sometimes it's really important and necessary.
Yeah, I think that as a society, we're kind of conditioned to think about these binaries. It's either this or that. It's either we're going to do these figures that people can identify with, or we do these abstract works. And I think it's a both. And I think about, for example, you know, Lynette Yotam Boyke's work, who has these figures, right? But they are fictional characters made up of all these different stories, you know, of people that she will basically kind of do this, you know, splicing in a way. Some of it's from dreams. And that's another way to kind of evoke a certain type of group of people. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can be very creative. And so just listening to Rhonda and Aruna talk, and then, you know, listening to Leslie's presentation, I do think that we also have selective memory about how short our new American, North American history is. You know, we're only a few hundred years old, and there's so much that has happened prior to this few hundred centuries. And so that's something else, you know, if you think about this hierarchy, it gets back to this power and the authority, is so much of what public monuments we identify with are very white and very male. And so what do we do? And how do we talk through that? And so, and not everything needs to be permanent. I'm more of like a temporal thing. Temporary thing could be 10 years, it could be 50 years, it could be 1 year, it could be a week. Also, what about sound? How can we evoke other different types of sensory experiences beyond just some physical, like material that we feel like we need to pay homage to?
I think, you know, one of the things that your comments raised for me too is just the implications and ethics of raising a physical monument on Indigenous land, right? And what that means as well, right? That you know, monuments claim space, right? Like that they claim space for some manifestation of power. And so what does it mean to do that within a context of settler colonialism, right? As well as everything else. So, you know, that it's complicated. I you know, both of the pieces that I showed, the Christoph Wodiczko and the Lauren Woods, are both sound-based, which is interesting, and they're both temporary, right? They are you know, in the Wodiczko, it's projected for a few months to activate, to reanimate, as he calls it, the statue, but then it's withdrawn, and it's in the withdrawal that the power is, right? Because otherwise it would just become, as Musil said, like, you know, this part of the, you know, the walls of our consciousness where we don't even notice it anymore. It's that punctuality. And the Lauren Woods, there's no imagery per se. It's just this sort of soundscape, essentially, this soundscape of structural racism, which is sort of horrifying, but also important to delineate at the same time, I think.
You know, the Alexander Brodsky piece that I showed, you know, one of the first things that he said when he saw these remnants was, they're all classical forms. And he was like, I know that there was more to Pittsburgh prior. So where are the other pieces? Where are they? Where are those structures that no longer exist? Getting back to the indigenous people that were here before those classical buildings. And so it's also about, how do we care for things? You know, who's caring for those objects that were here before these structures, these classical structures that we really hold in high esteem, that we actually kept? You know, why couldn't it be other things that could have been within that scaffolding, that bird cage that Sasha, sorry, we call him Sasha too, but Alexander did. So that's something else that I thought about when that was one of the first things he said to us when we took him into this building and he saw all of these classical forms. So he was actually very disappointed.
I think the other thing that I've been thinking about and merits consideration on this topic is, and Judith talks about this in her essay as well, is this false promise of inclusion. And, you know, thinking about public art in the different spaces that I've encountered it in my life, for example, temporary, you know, or permanent structures, graffiti on walls, on trains, folk craft art that I grew up knowing as art, and wasn't until I was an adult going for the first time, you know, in my late 20s to a museum and gallery space, was told that it wasn't, right? But this idea of how much romanticizing goes on with this, you know, where if we are included, artists of color, communities of color, in these conversations, and in these representations on some level, does that, you know, what does that do to our psyche, right? Because if no representation is representation, then a false premise of inclusion with representation is also just as problematic, right? Because it's that contradiction, that tension of we're here but we're not here, right? We're a part of this community but we don't see ourselves, or we see ourselves in very deliberate, intentional ways that you can pick out and then put us back, right? And I think that's something that that I've been thinking a lot about with as far as art in public community spaces, and how can I be an agent towards collaboration that is equitable and has my philosophy of my ethics of humankind, you know, at the forefront. And I think it's complicated. I think a lot of times it's complicated because those relationships are not clean. They're messy.
They are messy. And I think, you know, one of the reasons, I think for me, I just, you know, I'm always sort of analyzing myself for why I take certain positions. And part of it is part of my lack of, part of my lack of sentimentality around monuments is that, you know, I grew up in Canada. I live here. I'm South Asian origin. There will never be a monument, right? For my community. I mean, there may be somewhere down the road. Who knows? Like there could be, but you know, so that it's already a kind of, it's already a foreclosed question, right? So in a sense, like, you know, for me, it's not. It has. Like, I've left aside the representation question because for me, representation doesn't even seem a possibility, right? Like, so then it becomes just a question of what is the history now that we want to tell? And do we want to tell that history via these sort of punctual moments of centered on individuals, or do we want to try and tell histories in which the what is repressed by the monument and what is expressed by the monument are both visible, right? So in the case of the Lauren Woods piece, right, both the person who died and the person who killed them and the system of structural racism in which they were operating and having to function. All of that is communicated at one time. And to me, that's a really, I mean, you know, from an intellectual point of view, that's a really interesting proposal, right? Because to me, that is history, right? And so I think that, you know, and that's why I think that, you know, listening to Leslie and Kololo talk is that, you know, sometimes I have to remember that representation actually does matter, right? It should matter, right? But it's for me less urgent, I think, than these other questions, right? And I think that, you know, and I think that it you know, that there cannot be any valid representation of history, right, in the form of a monument or any other monument that doesn't take into account the real complexities of who lives here and how and who's excluded from here even, and how they experience both the opportunities, but also very much the violences of living here. So, you know, I think that in my ideal world, yes, like, you know, people's the experiences of people who have been minoritized, that have been marginalized, that have been otherwise disenfranchised would be very central to the monument, right? But also all of those systems that made them disenfranchised and, you know, marginalized and minoritized would also somehow be present, so that it wasn't simply propaganda, right? That it was a kind of fullness, like an admission of the real world in which we live in, the real culture, right? Like that Rhonda's talking about.
I think that's a really good point, because I think that the way that people respond to the shifts in the physical shifts and the ideological shifts and what we consider to be appropriate public art really tells the tale. Just quite honestly, every time I saw somebody video of somebody pulling down a Confederate statue, I got a little flutter in my heart, right? I mean, it just made me happy. Yeah, I've lived a fair amount of my life in the South, in the deep South. And so, I'm familiar. They're just there. They are a part of social life, and every time you have to pass by one of those things and you're aware, it's just another jab at you to remind you that you are the subordinate one here, right? So but at the same time, so I want to go back and I want to reference Mark Mark Quinn's work, the statue that was replaced. I think that that people had the same, well, not the same response, but the opposite response. So you get the happiness at the fact that, the elation at the fact that now this representation of the existing power structure has been pulled down, and then you also get elation though at the erection of the image of what the status quo should be, right? And I think that part of what's happening in this moment with us and public art is that, one, now it's accessible. Now, pulling down these monuments means that art can be accessible, and to whom we erect monuments can be accessible to a wider range of people. But the other thing is, it's very much a power shift, I think. I think in everybody's eyes, no matter from what perspective you're looking at, it's a power shift. I'm going to go back to Beyonce's Ape Shit video. The first time I saw that video, I literally was in my house screaming, "Oh my God, they took over the Louvre," right? A pop culture icon and a rapper took over the Louvre. They were all over that place. They put their fingerprints all over the Louvre. I was so happy about it. I'm still happy about it, right? But that's because what they did was they worked within the status quo, right? And they worked within this system, and they used their power to give this status quo art place, right, this new look, to put their fingerprints all over it. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with the tearing down of these monuments and our responses to them. I think to a large degree, we've been calling it public art, but is it really for all of the public? And I think now what we're seeing is public art that people are saying, yep, we want public art for literally all of the public. And that makes me really happy.
The thing that was so interesting to me about the Mark Quinn situation, right, is that part of the insistence on people and on different histories being represented in public space is also an insistence that people get to tell their own stories, right? That someone else isn't coming in and deciding. But it is also the act of destroying these statues, right? That photograph that you put up, Paula, about the, showing the people, pulling down that statue. The act of destroying these statues is a collective act, right? Like these are moments in which protesters are getting together and collectively taking it down. And I think part of it is then that whatever goes back up into space, right, also needs to be a collective act, right? Like that it needs to be collective. It cannot be one artist deciding what needs to go and sort of making it happen on their own, right? Like that's what that reveals to me is the extent to which and that's where the rub comes in, right? Like that's where the difficulties come in, because then there's the question of coming to some sort of consensus, right? That coming to some sort of idea. And, the replacement of the Marion Sims monument in Central Park, right, is so instructive in this case, because it was, here's this statue of this man who's supposed to be the father of, modern gynecology, but who, came up with his innovations by experimenting on enslaved women, often without even anesthesia. I mean, it was really serious concentration camp torture situations, right? And when the decision was made to take down the statue, then there was a competition, right, in New York to put something back up. And the idea was to put up a monument to the 3 women whose names we know that he experimented on. And it was I still haven't entirely sort of processed what happened around that competition, but it was so interesting because there were some fantastic proposals that were voted on by the Public Art Commission, and a piece was chosen by Simone Lee. And because of sort of public outcry within the room, right, the people who showed up for the meeting, that decision was basically overturned by the public art, or by the art commissioner, right, in New York, in favor of a very traditional, representational, heroicizing kind of statue, right? And that was really interesting because it was it was a moment in which you realize, like, in a sense, the disconnect between, in this case, I wondered the way in which art is, art being produced by sort of official artists is operating as the ideal culture as opposed to the real culture, or the ways in which aesthetics sort of complicate the ability to reach a consensus around what goes up, right, in public space. So, that's the other part of it, is that if we're imagining collectivity, right, and as being the upshot of, the replacement of public monuments, the idea of community, that monuments are not imposed but are decided upon by a community, then there's the question of the way in which the community may be interested in simply a reversal of, you take the bad guy and you put a good guy in the place, but you don't actually interrupt the logic of the monument in a certain sense, right?
Right, and that's where I think where this collective education and learning needs to happen, because there is that linear process, that very myopic process that does happen in this case that you're talking about. I mean, being an art commissioner for the city of Pittsburgh, we're right now talking about the Columbus statue, you know, and so once again, it's these binaries, it's either this or it's that. And, you know, listening to Rhonda, what you were saying about Beyonce and the video and also these kind of private displays in the public realm of wealth and power, how that plays out. It's the people with the money that's able to then commission the work. I liken that to what's happening in cultural institutions of how
Absolutely.
the curator's name, you know, the director's name is somebody's name and then the curator. And I'm like, that is so I think it's so wrong in so many different ways. Why would any institution allow that? There's so many different ways that somebody's money can do really, you know, just really good things with it, instead of why would you put somebody's name on a title? I mean, it's just so fraught. It's so fraught. Whereas I saw how, is it the Queens Museum or the Bronx Museum that does the social justice curator? That Jasmine
Wahi, yeah.
Yes. And so I thought that's interesting, but why are we always wanting to associate attaching somebody's name to a title, to a position? Because once again, that's saying something, that's positioning that person. Just like the Coke, you know, plaza at the Lincoln Center. I mean, there's just all this branding. It's a brand, and we're elevating certain people. And also, most of those people that have that brand positioning tend to be, once again, these very white, wealthy people. So we're just replicating that.
Don't you think that's the point, though, Kilolo? I kind of think that's the point. You know, we want you to remember just who brought you this art, right? It's not the artist that brought you the art. It's the people who wrote the check to get the artist here who brought you the art, which then takes it out of the realm of the public. Or maybe it's just, you know, let me sprinkle a little art on you, you filthy peasants. I don't know which message it is, but it sounds really intentional to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, the reaction to me of against that Mark Quinn intervention was precisely, you know, I think, Kilolo, what you were kind of getting at, and that is this larger discomfort, I think, and critique, questioning of the role of philanthropy in the cultural sphere, right? And that because that is right, Rhonda's right, that is the point, right? That and you know, the idea that, I mean, there's, you know, the problem with philanthropy is that some rich person gets to decide where they're going to, you know, what's important to them, where they're going to give their money, and how it's going to be spent, right? And so there, again, this is another way in which the kind of collective is shut out of a process, right? Shut out of a process of determining what's actually important to our country, to our communities, to our, you know, whatever it is, right? And so, you know, that seems to me the other part of it that comes around, both with museums and with monuments and with a lot of things right now, is the way in which that conversation about who's paying and how, right? Like who's actually putting up the money for this. And, you know, again, the Central Park, you know, another statue going up in Central Park that's like, you know, I mean, it's such a disaster. It's almost hard to even talk about the statue with the white suffragettes. I'm sorry, I'm having a total like brain fart here, but with you know what I'm talking about, right? The monument to the white suffragettes, and then the fantastic Black journalist who I'm so embarrassed that I'm like
Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells, thank you. That, and that they've decided to smash all these people together, even though the white suffragists were, the suffragists were extremely, racist in their approach. And, that this, how is, I keep looking at this thing, right, this sculpture, and it's like, how do these things get made? How do they get approved? Well, they get made and they get approved because of private philanthropy, right? And so that, from an aesthetic level, but also from a question of what history are we telling and how are we telling it, right? Like all of those things get taken out of a notion of a collective decision-making and put into private hands. And so, I think that's the other kind of issue that comes around when we're talking about these things, and whether a kind of fully public history can ever be articulated via these private mechanisms.
I'll just jump in quickly to ask a question from the Q&A, because remarkably, we're actually getting low on time. It's gone very quickly though. So I wanted to, earlier there was just a comment from Teresa to Rhonda to say, to kind of affirm the way you stated status quo requires propaganda. And I agree that was a really kind of succinct and powerful way of putting that. And then Patty's question, I think for everyone, is when a monument no longer serves its public and gets removed, where is the place for the monument? In a museum, destroyed, etc. And I'll just add to that because I think it really dovetails with points that you were all bringing up. Aruna, at one point you mentioned that when we have these acts of defacement, that's when the kind of latent meaning is revealed. That's this real flashpoint. And then Rhonda, you had also talked about that as revealing that space, right, between the ideal and the real. So these are clearly in some ways really instructive moments when we have defacement, when we realize that this monument no longer serves the public, but then in a strange way, it kind of is serving the public because it's highlighting those power inequities and starting conversations that perhaps were not happening in the public sphere prior. So, what do we do then? How long do we sort of tolerate the sculpture of Robert E. Lee, but with George Floyd projected onto its face? What do we do then? Do we think that the polity should make a decision and collectively destroy this? Do we put them in some sort of museum to problematic monuments? I mean, these are questions, of course, that come up a lot, but I think they're important questions. What do you all think?
That would be a huge museum.
Basically, I always think, you know that thing about like dust mites, right? Dust mites like eat our like little skin cells, right? Our used up skin cells, so that we don't all just, humankind doesn't drown in skin cells. And I think that I think of monuments that way, right? Monuments of like the detritus from our, but this is the thing, right? Like in almost no cases, right? Or no, I shouldn't say in almost no cases, but very rarely are people talking about taking down monuments that have actual aesthetic value. And I know that all of those terms are relative, but like, honestly, like, these are kitschy sculptures, right? And so I sort of feel like the desire to preserve, right, it's not being driven by any real assessment of aesthetic value, right? Like it's being driven by a nostalgia about the ideology that adheres to these monuments, right? And so I have we destroy monuments all the time. Like monuments have been melted down to make bullets to fight wars, right? There is a point at which we all, over the course of the history of the West, that monuments have been taken down for all kinds of reasons, right? And no one has freaked out. And why are people freaking out about taking down monuments to the Confederacy? Why? Because they're racist. Like that's why. There's a simple answer to that question, and that is the answer, right? Like, if people decided that like the metal from monuments were the essential new ingredient for the next iPhone, those monuments would be coming down in a hot minute. No one would care. Why do they care now? They care now because it's not an attack on the aesthetic value of monuments. It's an attack on white supremacy, and people really, really like white supremacy. Some people, obviously, not me, but like ultimately that's it. So to me, yes, if there's a case where like, Rodin has done a monument and you really care about that monument, like, yeah, fine, like figure out where to put it in a museum. But for 99% of the things that we're talking about, whatever, like no one liked how they looked when they went up. They were just ordered out of a Sears catalog or whatever it was, right? Like, these are not things to, I think they're not things to worry about.
Runa, when you were talking about melting things down, like metal for bullets for the war, Alexander Brodsky told me that in Russia, they had taken down these Stalin monuments, and depending on what this material was, whether it was limestone or whatever, they would crush it up and use it and turn it in for something else, for like road pavers. Also, some of the softer materials, they melted that down for artists to actually use it to make other things. Yeah. And I thought that was so innovative to do. And
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
But but art, that's the funny thing, right? Is that artists have been doing this with artworks all the time, right? Like, whatever, how many times do we find out that an artist used an old canvas that had a painting on it and painted over it, right? Like, the idea of destruction and reuse in the artistic context is like a foundational idea, right? Like that destruction is sort of an essential part of the creative process, right? Even if it's the destruction of like putting down a mark on a pristine surface, right? Like that, that there's that is part of the logic of art making and always has been. And so when people start freaking out that like, oh, this is destruction, these aren't the Banyan Buddhas or something like that. These are like, you know what I mean? Like there are moments in which cultural destruction is a real, tragedy and really needs to be resisted. But in this case, in most of this case, no one's going to forget about, people are, no one is going to forget about the history of slavery more than many people in this country have already tried to forget about the history of slavery because the Confederate monuments come down, right? Like that argument is just,
I bring it back. I think about, once again, in these cultural institutions on how some of these institutions are deaccessioning work to make room for, more work by women, more work by non-white people. And so they're like, okay, how many Warhols do we need? Right? How many Jasper Johns works do we need?
Yep.
And so, so that's something else that I think about. But so much of the case is like people are so vehemently opposed to this because they think that it is taking away from their heritage. And I'm always talking about like, well, let's think about the collective. Let's think about who else is not being considered here. Yeah. And when you ask people that, most of the time, they never stop to think about that. It's usually about the individual, that individual culture, and not about more of this universality or this collective. So,
yeah.
In the Q&A, Teresa commented, many of these monuments were made in the 1940s and 1970s. And I think that really speaks to, many of you asked the question, whose history is being represented? And it's a similar question, what history does this commemorate? And certainly many of these monuments, you know, they're not irrevocably past. They're not, it's not as though they were magically erected the moment these events took place. They were, you know, when suffrage debates were happening, when Jim Crow laws were being erected as, you know, monuments of intimidation, basically. And then Leslie, it looks like you just responded to that question about Judy Baca. That's great. We're actually we just have a couple of moments left. And I just want to quickly remind everyone in the audience to tune in tomorrow. The first event is at noon, I believe. It's a professional feedback session. So that should be fun and productive. And you can look and find out more about how to register for that on the SculptureX website. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation and we've covered a lot of ground. Does anyone have any final thoughts that they want to throw out to kind of, you know, close things up tonight?
I just want to say what a pleasure it was to talk with all of you, and I wish we could all be in the same room. But one day, inshallah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It was wonderful sharing this space.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Paula, for facilitating this.
Yeah, of course. No, I learned a lot. This was fascinating. Thanks to you all. And thanks to everyone in the audience for thoughtful comments and questions. And I'm certainly excited for events over the next few days. So hopefully see everyone again soon.
All right, bye-bye.